How Susan rebuilt her identity after an abusive relationship. At first, everything seemed perfect. Susan, 24, a recent psychology graduate, was excited about the future. At a friend's birthday party, she met Marcus, a charismatic, intelligent, extremely kind man and, above all, someone who seemed different. He knew exactly what to say, was attentive, gave frequent compliments, and showed a kind of sensitivity that she didn't see in others. Susan, who had just come out of a troubled period in her academic life, saw Marcus as an emotional refuge, someone who finally understood her. This feeling of immediate connection was the first link in the chain that would slowly close around her. For the first few months, Marcus was the perfect man. He texted her every day, prepared surprises, and wanted to spend as much time with her as possible. In Susan's eyes, this seemed like the beginning of a true love, one of those rare, movie kind. She began to give up little things, dinners with friends, a course she had signed up for, even meetings with her family. Marcus said he missed her when she went out, that he wanted to enjoy every moment together. Susan, delighted, gave in, believing that this was just a sign of intense passion. But small signs began to emerge. Subtle criticisms about her clothes, disguised jokes that diminished her opinions, invasive questions about where she was and with whom. At first, Susan saw all this as concern, as zeal. After all, he used to say, "It's only because I love you so much." Whenever she tried to express annoyance, he would respond with guilt. "You're exaggerating," or "You're seeing things where there aren't any." And little by little, she began to doubt her own perception. What Susan didn't know, and would only understand much later, is that this is one of the most common cycles in abusive relationships. The initial enchantment is no accident. It's a carefully constructed emotional trap. The abuser often presents himself as everything the person wants. They don't pressure you straight away. He seduces, conquers, offers an idealized version of himself, precisely in order to gradually have enough emotional power to manipulate and control. This first phase of idealization is also the most confusing for the victim. Because, in theory, there is nothing too wrong. Everything can be interpreted as too much love, as too intense a relationship. Susan, like many other women, didn't see the warning signs because she was emotionally invested in the image of Marcus that he himself had projected. What's more, she thought she could save the relationship, as if loving intensely was enough to cure any problematic behavior. This beginning, where everything looks like love, but it's control in disguise, is what makes abusive relationships so difficult to identify. The victim doesn't enter a prison. They enter a custom-built paradise. Only then does she realize that the walls are closing in and the door has disappeared. Over the months, the Susan everyone knew slowly disappeared, but the most frightening thing was that she didn't realize it herself. At first, they were small, almost imperceptible changes. She stopped painting her nails the way she liked, started wearing clothes that Marcus preferred, stopped listening to her favorite bands because he said they were too depressing. Everything seemed to be done out of love, out of a desire to please. But these concessions, so constant and unilateral, were actually symptoms of a slow erosion of her autonomy. Marcus only praised certain attitudes when they coincided with what he wanted. When Susan took a firm stand or made her own decisions, he reacted with coldness, irony, or even punitive silence. So she began to keep more quiet. She avoided conflict. She adapted her personality to avoid friction. Over time, she no longer knew which opinions were really her own and which were reflections of what Marcus expected of her. The loss of identity in an abusive relationship doesn't happen suddenly. It happens gradually through a combination of emotional manipulation, emotional dependency, and social isolation. Marcus subtly alienated Susan from her friends. He criticized her friends, saying that they were envious or didn't mean well by her. And when she began to drift away, he would praise her. "Now you're evolving." His approval became the new criterion of personal value. This made Susan try harder and harder to deserve his love. She also began to question her ability. Marcus often told her that she was confused, that she didn't know what she wanted in life. Little by little, Susan began to doubt her own intelligence, her choices, even her memories. This process is known as gaslighting, when the abuser distorts information or manipulates facts so that the victim doubts their own sanity. Even though she had a degree in psychology, Susan couldn't see clearly what was happening. This shows that emotional abuse is not about a lack of intellectual knowledge, but about how the victim is emotionally involved and conditioned to believe that they are the cause of the conflicts. She started to live in emotional survival mode, trying to avoid crises, anticipating Marcus' wishes, walking on eggshells. When she looked in the mirror, she didn't recognize herself. The sparkle in her eyes was gone. Her professional plans were shelved. Her self-confidence turned to dust. And the cruelest thing, she thought it was her fault. That she was being difficult, unstable, too sensitive. This internal confusion is exactly what traps so many people in cycles of abuse. Susan's loss of identity was silent, disguised as love. And it was only when the emptiness inside her became deafening that something began to awaken. She was no longer Susan. She was a shadow of herself. And this realization, however painful, would be the beginning of her reconstruction. Every story of transformation begins with a turning point, that instant when inner silence becomes noise, and what was previously endured with resignation becomes unbearable. For Susan, this breaking point didn't come with shouting or a dramatic scene. It came in a simple but deeply symbolic gesture. She was washing the dishes as she did every night, when she suddenly felt tears welling up, without knowing exactly why. But in that instant, she realized she was exhausted, spiritually exhausted, and the most painful thing, she no longer recognized who she was. That week, Marcus had subtly criticized her body, jokingly comparing her to other women. He had complained about the food, her tone of voice, the time she spent on her cell phone, even if it was just answering her mother. None of these episodes were new. The difference was that this time, Susan didn't have the strength to justify herself. She just absorbed it, as she always did. But something inside her began to scream. It was as if her long-suffocated essence was taking one last breath before disappearing completely. And that silent cry, coming from deep within her chest, echoed unmistakably, "Enough." The breakup, therefore, was not caused by an isolated event, but by a succession of subtle violences that, accumulated over time, pushed her to the limit. There is a concept in psychology called accumulated cost. It's the point at which suffering becomes so chronic and normalized that the person only realizes how serious it is when their body starts to implode. Anxiety attacks, insomnia, unexplained pain, extreme apathy. Susan reached this point. She started having memory lapses. She would cry alone in the bathroom and then put on makeup to pretend everything was fine. Her closest friends no longer recognized her. One day, one of them asked her out, and when Susan refused for the third time in a row, she heard, "You're gone. You look like someone else." That hurt, because it was true. But the real trigger came in a conversation with her 6-year-old niece. While they were playing, the little girl looked at Susan and asked, "You're sad, aren't you, Auntie? Why don't you smile anymore?" The question pierced her soul. Children see what adults pretend not to see. At that moment, Susan felt ashamed. Not of the child, but of herself, for letting it get that far. It was there, in front of the innocence of a child, that she saw herself as in a mirror, and she decided that she needed to seek help. For the first time in a long time, she put on her headphones, went for a walk, put on a playlist she liked, and cried from start to finish. But this time, not from sadness. It was the beginning of liberation. This breaking point was neither magical nor immediate. She would still have her lapses, doubts and fear, but it was the symbolic milestone of an internal awakening. The moment when she realized that continuing in that relationship meant dying a slow death. And she decided she didn't want to survive. She wanted to live and find herself again. Getting out of an abusive relationship isn't like turning off a light switch. It's a process that involves internal struggle, emotional ambivalence, and, above all, a lot of fear. In Susan's case, the decision to break up didn't happen overnight. After the breaking point, she began to mentally rehearse her exit like someone training to escape from emotional captivity. Although the relationship had no obvious signs of physical violence, the psychological control, the subtle humiliations, and the stripping away of her identity were cruel forms of imprisonment in themselves. In the days that followed her silent decision to move, Susan began to make small moves. She started to save money without Marcus knowing. She talked discreetly to a trusted friend and went back to see the psychologist she had left months before at his request. Each of these steps seemed small, but required immense courage. The fear that he was making the wrong decision was constant. After all, Marcus had never been aggressive in public. In his family's eyes, he was charismatic. He knew how to behave, and she feared that no one would believe her if she decided to expose what she lived between four walls. There were relapses. In one of these attempts to break up, Susan had a frank conversation with Marcus. He cried, promised to change, said that she was everything in his life. For a few days, he was sweet, attentive, the so-called honeymoon cycle, common in abusive relationships. And Susan, vulnerable and still emotionally trapped, decided to give him one more chance. This return was followed by a brief period of calm, but soon the manipulative behavior returned. The veiled criticism, the control over what she did, the comments that undermined her self-esteem. These relapses, although painful, were fundamental for Susan to realize that it wasn't a question of a lack of love, but of emotional survival. With each failed attempt to leave, she understood better the cycle of manipulation to which she was subjected. And each frustration silently fed the certainty that she could no longer go back. The final break came on an ordinary morning. Marcus had a fit of jealousy after seeing an exchange of messages between Susan and a work colleague, even though the conversation was purely professional. He accused Susan of flirting, shouted, locked her cell phone in a cupboard and stormed out. There was no physical aggression, but at that moment, Susan saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before, a total loss of control. It was as if the veneer of his charming personality had completely cracked. And she was afraid, genuinely afraid for her own emotional and physical safety. The next morning, she quietly left the house. She went straight to her trusted friend's house and decided she wasn't coming back. The breakup was difficult, involving persistent messages, emotional blackmail, and even veiled threats. But Susan stood her ground. She changed her phone number. She changed her address. Most importantly, she began to rebuild her emotional autonomy little by little. The separation, therefore, was not a sudden act, but a gradual process full of twists and turns. It was a long, painful, but absolutely necessary journey. The definitive break represented not only the end of a relationship, but the beginning of a profound commitment to her own freedom, dignity, and identity. It was the moment when Susan finally chose herself. The separation process for Susan was perhaps the most ambiguous and emotionally devastating chapter of her journey. Breaking up with an abusive relationship is often more complex than leaving an ordinary one. Not because there is a lack of desire for freedom, but because abuse is often cloaked in bonds of dependency, fear, and guilt. After months of living under emotional and psychological control, Susan began to have flashes of awareness that something was deeply wrong. The relationship wasn't nourishing her, it wasn't welcoming her, it was draining her. However, even with this rational understanding, the emotional bond kept her trapped. She still believed that she could help him change, that perhaps she was exaggerating, that she should give it another chance. This self-deception is common in abusive relationships because the aggressor often alternates between moments of emotional violence and sudden displays of affection, confusing the victim's perception. She tried to break up for the first time in silence. She avoided confrontation, just walked away for a few days, saying she needed space. Marcus cried, apologized, promised therapy, a radical change. And, like so many other women, Susan believed, or wanted to. She went back, driven by hope, guilt, and fear. But the old patterns soon returned. The subtle criticism, the isolation from friends, the attacks disguised as concern. These relapses, although painful, were important in strengthening her clarity. Each return made it clearer that Marcus would not change, and that change could only come from her. The final turning point came after a seemingly minor but symbolic episode. During an argument, Marcus tore up a notebook where Susan had written her personal reflections. He said that she spent too much time thinking nonsense, instead of focusing on the relationship. That disrespectful attitude towards her intimacy was the trigger. Susan, for the first time, didn't cry or argue. She just decided. The final breakup was meticulously planned. She left home when Marcus went on a business trip with the help of a friend and a transport app. She changed her address, blocked contacts, told people at work, and asked them not to pass on any information. For the first few days, fear persisted. Fear of running into him in the street, of him turning up unannounced, of her giving in again. But she resisted. Every day away was a small act of rebuilding her autonomy. The separation was the milestone of a rebirth. There were no explosions or cinematic gestures. There was silence, firmness, and above all, courage. The break was not just with Marcus, but with the version of herself that accepted little, that believed she didn't deserve more. It was the moment when Susan chose, with all the consequences, to prioritize her own emotional freedom. This phase symbolizes the most difficult crossing of a journey, the break with what had hurt her, but which she had called love for a long time. After the final break, Susan experienced something that many people who leave abusive relationships don't expect: a deep emptiness. There was the idea that, once free, she would feel relieved, strengthened, and ready to start again. But in practice, the days that followed were shrouded in silence and strangeness. For the first time in years, no one controlled her schedule, her clothes, her opinions. But instead of celebrating this freedom, Susan felt lost, as if she had forgotten what it was like to be herself. Her previous relationship, although destructive, had become a structure. She knew how to behave within it, even if it meant canceling herself out. Outside it, there was no longer a persona shaped by Marcus' demands and moods. The mirror now reflected a woman who needed to rediscover herself from the start. Who was Susan without the shouting? Who was Susan without the constant blame, without the apologies she repeated even when she hadn't done anything wrong? This phase was marked by deep pain, not necessarily longing for the person, but longing for herself, or for the version of herself she had lost. At night, the silence of the new apartment sounded like a nagging reminder that, despite her courage, she was alone. She cried, yes, but now for different feelings, for the time she had lost, for the friendships she had lost, for the dreams she had put on hold. What's more, the emotional trauma didn't disappear with the breakup. Small triggers, such as a harsh comment from a colleague or the play of a song that used to play during the good times of the old relationship, triggered intense memories. Susan sometimes wondered if she had overreacted, if it really was abuse, if it wasn't just a bad relationship. This confusion is common. The cycle of manipulation profoundly affects the victim's self-perception and sense of reality. But within this void, there was also a silent opportunity. For the first time in a long time, Susan could hear her own voice, even if it was still weak. It started with small gestures: cooking something she really liked, listening to music that Marcus had banned, rereading the books that inspired her. Each of these choices was a loose thread of identity being reattached. It was also during this period that she began to write, without censorship, without fear of being judged. She wrote in notebooks, cell phone notes, or in letters that would never be sent. It was her way of giving form to her internal chaos and organizing her emotions. This process of verbalization helped her separate what came from the trauma from what was genuinely hers. The void, although frightening, proved fertile. It was virgin ground where Susan would begin to plant new references about herself. Freedom, once confusing, became a tool. She realized that she didn't need to fill the space immediately with a new relationship, with distractions, or with obligations. She could just inhabit the space, explore it with patience and gentleness. This was the beginning of a slow, intimate, and powerful reunion. Susan still didn't feel cured, but now she had something she had been denied for a long time: space to breathe, to make mistakes, to exist. From this silence, a new voice was born, more authentic, firmer, and finally free. After months of navigating the murky waters of emptiness, Susan began to realize something subtle but transformative. She no longer needed to depend emotionally on anyone to feel valid. During the abusive relationship, her self-esteem was constantly undermined. Marcus made her believe that without him she would be nobody, that nobody would accept her, that nobody would love her. But time, combined with small actions of personal reconnection, began to erode these ties. Susan began to have moments of clarity in which she found herself smiling by herself when doing something simple: cooking a favorite dish, taking a leisurely walk in the park, talking to someone without fear of being reprimanded afterwards. Little by little, she began to see that these moments of peace, of genuine joy, were hers. They didn't come from outside, they didn't depend on external approval. They were the fruit of her own presence with herself. This was the turning point towards emotional autonomy. For the first time, Susan stopped seeking outside validation and began to build a truer image of herself internally. Not the image shaped by the judgments of a controlling partner, but that of a woman who survived, learned, and began to flourish. This transition was neither magical nor immediate. There were still days when she questioned herself, when guilt, that echo of psychological abuse, returned. But with the help of therapy, reading, and even podcasts about trauma and self-knowledge, Susan began to identify the patterns she had previously accepted as normal. She began to understand what healthy love was, what self-care was, what boundaries were, words that had previously seemed distant, abstract, and were now part of her emotional vocabulary. In one of the most symbolic moments of this phase, Susan looked in the mirror and said out loud, "I deserve to be respected. I deserve to be truly loved. And if that doesn't come from outside, I'm going to build it from within." It may seem simple, but for someone who had been convinced for years that she was worthless, saying this with such revelation was revolutionary. It was also during this period that Susan distanced herself from people who doubted her. Old friends who judged her for giving up on the relationship or family members who minimized her pain began to be seen more clearly. Susan understood that true love does no harm, does not diminish, does not silence. And this extends not only to romantic relationships, but to all bonds in life. By achieving this emotional autonomy, she did not become invulnerable or cold, quite the opposite. Susan became more open, more capable of feeling without drowning, of connecting without nullifying herself. She began to choose where she would put her emotional energy, learn to say no without guilt, and most importantly, learn to embrace herself in moments of pain. This new relationship with her emotions was the foundation for everything that would come after. It wasn't just about overcoming an abusive relationship, but about reinventing herself from it. Susan began to see the woman she was forming in the mirror, resilient, aware, and deeply connected to herself. She no longer wanted to go back to the past. Now, each step was toward a life with purpose, built on the emotional freedom she once thought she would never have. During the abusive relationship, Susan's self-image was systematically distorted. Her partner made her feel inadequate, weak, and selfish, even for wanting simple things like space, silence, or time for herself. The constant abuse, often subtle and silent, eroded the way she saw herself. Every time she tried to set a limit or express a need, she was called difficult, dramatic, or over the top. And over time, Susan began to believe it. After the breakup, even after she was free from the relationship, she remained trapped in this distorted image. She felt guilty for prioritizing herself. She felt wrong for wanting to rebuild her life. When she looked in the mirror, she didn't just see her physical reflection. She saw all the words she had heard over the years, echoing in her mind. But a subtle process began to take place. Susan began to consume content that talked about emotional abuse, self-esteem, and personal development. As she listened to stories from other women who had gone through similar experiences, she began to realize that she was not alone. More importantly, she began to realize that much of what she believed was her fault was actually the result of emotional manipulation. This awareness was the first step in reclaiming her identity. Susan decided that she needed to build, almost from scratch, a new way of seeing herself, not based on pain but on truth. She started with small rituals. Every day, before going to bed, she would write down 3 things she had done well. Sometimes it was something simple, like saying no to a request that would overwhelm her. Other times, it was something bigger, like allowing herself to rest without feeling guilty. This habit gradually began to change her internal dialogue. She also began to look at herself more lovingly. When she looked in the mirror, instead of looking for flaws, she began to ask herself, "What is beautiful about me that I never learned to see?" At first, this was uncomfortable. But over time, Susan began to see more than her physical appearance. She began to recognize her courage, her patience, her empathy. The process of rebuilding her self-image also involved reclaiming dreams and interests that had been stifled. For years, she had put aside her love of writing, dancing, and even the way she dressed, all to fit into the version that her ex-partner said was acceptable. Now, she allowed herself to wear what she wanted, listen to the music she loved, and write texts that spoke of her pain and her strength. Little by little, Susan was recovering parts of herself that she thought were lost forever. And with that, her self-image began to change. From a silent victim, she began to see herself as a survivor. From an insecure woman, she began to recognize herself as someone rebuilding herself. Imperfect, yes, but deeply true. A symbolic moment of this turning point was when Susan decided to do a photo shoot alone. She wanted to record not just a new appearance, but a new phase. At the beginning of the shoot, she was still shy and reserved. But as the photos went on, she began to let herself go, smiling genuinely, showing in her eyes what she felt inside. I'm back. This wasn't the end of the process, but a milestone. Rebuilding your self-image isn't about creating a perfect version of yourself. It's about looking at yourself with compassion, respect, and truth. Susan understood that she no longer needed to be who they said she was. Now, she was learning, every day, to be who she really is, and that was liberating. After the end of her abusive relationship, Susan faced one of the biggest challenges in the rebuilding process, learning to trust herself again. For a long time, every choice she made was questioned, invalidated, or ridiculed by her ex-partner. If she chose a new course, he would say it was a waste of time. If she wanted to go out with a friend, he would accuse her of being irresponsible. Over the years, Susan internalized the idea that she didn't know how to make decisions, that she needed his approval, or someone else's, for every step she took. This emotional dependence didn't disappear overnight. Even after freeing herself from the relationship, Susan found herself paralyzed when faced with simple choices. She would spend hours deciding between two paths, asking friends for advice on personal matters that she would have otherwise resolved with ease. There was a deep wound inside her, the fear of making mistakes, of disappointing others, of not knowing what she was doing. But there was also, albeit timidly, a strength wanting to emerge. An inner voice that said, "You can do it. You've survived the worst." Little by little, Susan understood that regaining her emotional autonomy was not about always being right, but about allowing herself to make mistakes and learn. It was about trusting that, even if the choice was not perfect, she would have the strength and maturity to deal with the consequences. And this understanding began with small actions. She began to make decisions without consulting anyone. Simple things, like choosing a book to read, rearranging the furniture in her room, or deciding what to do on a weekend. The important thing was that the decision was hers alone, and that she accepted her choice without feeling guilty or doubting herself. Susan also started keeping a decision journal. Whenever she made an important choice, she would record what she had felt before, during, and after the decision. This helped her see patterns, fears, and also victories. She realized that many times, even though she was insecure, she had made good decisions. And when she made a mistake, it wasn't the end of the world. It was a learning experience. Another key step was understanding her own values. The abusive relationship had disconnected Susan from her beliefs and priorities. She was constantly trying to please someone who was never satisfied. Now, free from that prison, she asked herself, what really matters to me? Once she figured this out, her decisions became more purposeful. Instead of trying to guess what others expected, she began to ask herself, is this aligned with who I want to be? A defining moment in this process was when Susan decided to turn down a job that seemed ideal to others but would take her away from her real plans. For the first time in years, she listened to her intuition. And even though many around her questioned her decision, she stood firm. It was a symbolic act. She was choosing her own voice. Over time, Susan learned to differentiate fear from instinct. Before, any fear would make her retreat. Now, she could assess more clearly. Does this fear come from a real intuition or from an insecurity that has been implanted in me? This skill, cultivated with patience, gave her back the sense of control that had been stolen. Today, Susan understands that having emotional autonomy does not mean not asking for help, but rather knowing that, in the end, the responsibility for her life is in her hands, and that is empowering. She has regained her confidence and is able to take charge of her path with dignity. Each conscious choice, no matter how small, has become an affirmation of freedom. I am capable of guiding my own life. During her abusive relationship, Susan was systematically deconstructed. Cruel words and looks of contempt gradually undermined the image she had of herself. She went from being a spontaneous, creative, and confident woman to someone who felt small, confused, and insecure. Her partner told her that she was not good enough, that no one would accept her, that she was exaggerated, dramatic, and difficult to love. And over time, Susan began to believe it. A lack of self-love does not arise from a single attack, but from small, everyday cracks that accumulate. Susan got used to looking in the mirror and not liking what she saw. Not only physically, but emotionally. She felt ashamed of her own sensitivity, blamed herself for everything that went wrong, and constantly compared herself to other women. The way others looked at her, especially her partner, was the barometer of her worth. And since that look was always critical, she always felt inadequate. But after the breakup, even though she was devastated, something began to change. In the silence of solitude, without someone constantly dictating who she was able to see herself with new eyes. And Susan understood a painful but liberating truth. No one would restore her self-esteem for her. She would have to rebuild it, from scratch, with patience and courage. The first step was to stop punishing herself. She realized that she spoke to herself with the same harshness that her ex-partner treated her. So she began to practice self-compassion, not as a cliché, but as a need for emotional survival. When she made a mistake, instead of mentally insulting herself, she would embrace herself. You're trying, and that's already worthy. Another important step was reconnecting with who she was before the abuse. Susan revived forgotten hobbies. She went back to painting, something that made her feel alive. She went back to dancing at home, to wearing clothes that expressed her essence, not the taste of someone who wanted her to be erased. These small actions were ways of reminding herself that she was so much more than she had been led to believe. She also began writing letters to herself. In one of them she wrote, "You are enough right now, just the way you are. You don't have to deserve love, you already have it." These words became her mantras on difficult days, when the shadow of insecurity would come back. And it would come back many times. The process of recovering self-love is not linear. But Susan learned that each setback was also an opportunity to deepen her self-acceptance. Over time, Susan began to take care of herself more gently. She invested in therapy, reestablished her circle of friends with people who genuinely supported her, and started exercising again not for aesthetic reasons, but for health and well-being. She replaced demands with celebration. Instead of demanding results, she began to recognize efforts. One of the biggest turning points was when Susan was able to look at herself in the mirror and smile. Not because she felt perfect, but because for the first time in a long time, she could see a courageous woman there. A woman who had been through emotional hell and yet was still standing. Whole. Wounded, yes, but real. Strong, true. Rebuilding her self-love was, for Susan, an act of rebellion and rebirth. She understood that she was not what people said about her. She was what she built within herself, every day. Her value was not in being desired, accepted, or validated. Her value was in existing with dignity. And this truth, now non-negotiable, became the basis of her new life. Susan never imagined that the story of pain she tried so hard to hide would one day become her brightest strength. During the abusive relationship, she kept quiet out of shame, fear, and confusion. She felt that no one would understand, that perhaps she was exaggerating, that she was the one who was wrong. But as she broke the cycle, as she reconstructed her identity and learned to love herself again, something began to grow inside her. The certainty that her experience could not end in silence. At first, sharing her story seemed impossible. Words still hurt too much. But little by little, Susan understood that her journey was not hers alone. She represented thousands of other women who were still trapped in destructive relationships, invisible to the world and, often, even to themselves. It was then that she decided she would speak out, not to relive the pain, but to name what so many still could not identify: emotional abuse, manipulation, control disguised as love. Susan started out simply. She wrote a short text on her social media, sharing fragments of what she had experienced. She didn't give details or reveal names, But she revealed the essential, that she had spent years denying herself, thinking she deserved little, and that she was now learning to rebuild herself. The response was overwhelming. Messages of support, outbursts from other women, stories of identification. That seed of courage had touched other souls. Over time, Susan began to use her voice more intentionally. She created a blog where she spoke in more depth about her healing journey. She began to study abusive relationships, trauma psychology, and self-esteem. Not to become an expert, but to better understand what she had experienced and to help other women see their own realities. Through her texts and videos, she explained subtle signs of abuse, talked about the cycle of violence, about the fear that paralyzes and the guilt that destroys from within. But she also spoke of hope, of possible new beginnings, of reconstruction. Susan had unwittingly become a role model for many. She often received messages from women who said, "You helped me realize that what I'm experiencing is not love," or "Your video gave me the courage to come out." These messages moved her deeply, but they also reinforced her commitment. She knew that by making visible what had been experienced in the dark, she was breaking an intergenerational cycle of silence and submission. The most powerful thing, however, was realizing that her mission went beyond helping other women escape abusive relationships. It was about helping women rediscover their strength, their freedom, their ability to live a full life with dignity and authenticity. She organized conversation circles, gave lectures, and participated in social projects aimed at women in vulnerable situations. Every teary-eyed face that listened to her was a reminder that her pain was not in vain. But Susan always reinforced one thing: "I am not a heroine. I am just someone who one day found herself at rock bottom and decided she didn't want to live there anymore. What healed me wasn't magic, it was a process. And that process is available to all of us." Transforming her own pain into service to others didn't erase her scars, but it gave them meaning. Today, Susan lives with more peace, more awareness, and more truth. She understands that her mission is not to save anyone, but to shine little lights on the path, so that each woman can find her own way out. Her story has become a beacon, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. And it is in this raw and courageous reality that Susan inspires so many others to break the silence and, like her, start over.